What does it feel like when the greatest empire on earth begins to die? Not in one dramatic moment, not with a single battle or a king falling on his sword, but slowly, quietly, like a crack spreading through ice, like a storm that has already passed, leaving behind a silence too strange to trust. For a time, the Mongol Empire seemed beyond collapse. It was vast beyond imagination, stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the plains of Hungary, from the forests of Siberia to the Persian Gulf. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols had done what no power before them had ever done. They had bound together enormous stretches of Eurasia under one imperial system. Armies moved with terrifying speed. Merchants crossed continents. Envoys, scholars, artisans, and prisoners were swept from one end of the world to the other. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Cities that submitted were folded into a machine of tribute, trade, and imperial order. To their enemies, they were a nightmare sent by heaven. To many who lived under their rule, they were something more complicated. Brutal conquerors, yes, but also protectors of roads, patrons of trade, and rulers of an empire that made the world feel suddenly connected. And that is what makes their fall so haunting. Because when something that enormous breaks apart, it does not vanish alone. It takes millions of lives, entire dynasties, and the shape of the future with it. The seeds of that fall were planted at the very height of Mongol power. In 1259, Mongol Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan and the great Khan of the empire, died during a campaign in China. His death did more than leave a throne empty. It exposed the truth that had been hidden beneath generations of conquest. The empire was too large, too diverse, and too dependent on the authority of one ruling family to remain united forever. Two brothers, Kublai and Arik-Boke, each claimed the right to succeed Mongke. What followed was not just a struggle over succession. It was a civil war for the soul of the empire. Kublai, governing from northern China and increasingly drawn toward Chinese models of rulership, represented one future. Arik-Boke, based in the Mongolian heartland, represented another, rooted more deeply in the traditions of the steppe. Kublai eventually won, but victory came at a terrible cost. The unity forged by Genghis Khan had been broken. The empire did not disappear overnight. Instead, it hardened into separate khanates, each ruled by branches of the same imperial family but increasingly acting on their own. In China, Kublai founded the Yuan dynasty. In Persia and much of the Middle East, the Il-Khanate took shape. In the western steppes, the Golden Horde ruled over the lands north of the Black and Caspian Seas, including the Russian principalities as tributaries. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate endured, divided, and unstable. On paper, they were still part of a greater Mongol world. In reality, they were drifting apart. This was the first wound, division, and division changed everything. The Mongol Empire had been built by horsemen who valued mobility, loyalty, and conquest. But ruling settled civilizations changed the rulers themselves. In China, the Yuan emperors adopted many practices of Chinese statecraft. In Persia, the Il-Khans increasingly embraced Persian administrative traditions and eventually Islam. In the western steppes, the Golden Horde developed its own political culture, deeply influenced by Turkic and Islamic worlds. The Khanates still remembered Genghis Khan. They still claimed his legacy. But they no longer shared a single political center, a single strategic purpose, or even a single identity. The Mongols had conquered half the known world, but they could not conquer the one force that has humbled every empire in history: fragmentation from within. As the four khanates pulled away from one another, old strengths began turning into weaknesses. The empire that had once thrived on movement became vulnerable because of movement. The trade routes that connected east and west, routes the Mongols had protected and expanded, carried not only silk, silver, and spices, but death. In the mid-14th century, plague moved across Eurasia with devastating force. The Black Death did not destroy the Mongol world by itself, and historians still debate exactly how the disease moved and where it first spread in each region. But what is clear is this: the interconnected world the Mongols had helped create became one of the channels through which disease traveled. Towns emptied, armies weakened, tax revenues collapsed, fear spread faster than any decree. The same roads that had once made the Mongol age seem unstoppable now carried grief from city to city. In Persia, the Il-Khanate was already in trouble. Its rulers had faced internal rivalries, fiscal strain, and political instability for years. Then, in 1335, Abu Sa'id, the last effective Il-Khan ruler, died without a clear heir. The result was disintegration. Regional warlords, local dynasties, and rival claimants tore the former Il-Khanate apart. What had once been one of the great successor states of the Mongol Empire dissolved into a patchwork of competing powers. For ordinary people, this was not an abstract political transition. It meant insecurity, war, heavier taxation, and the collapse of any stable order they might once have depended on. In China, the Yuan dynasty faced a different but equally deadly crisis. The Mongols had ruled China since Kublai Khan formally declared the Yuan dynasty in 1271 and completed the conquest of the southern Song in 1279. But Mongol rule over China was never simple. The Yuan court stood at the top of an enormous and sophisticated society with long political traditions of its own. Ethnic tensions persisted. Court politics were bitter. Natural disasters struck repeatedly. Flooding of the Yellow River, famine, and economic dislocation fed widespread anger. To many Chinese subjects, these disasters were not random. They were signs. In the political and moral logic of the time, they suggested that the Yuan had lost the mandate of heaven. Then rebellion came, the Red Turban movements, drawing on religious expectations, social unrest, and hatred of Yuan rule, spread across parts of China in the 14th century. Out of this chaos emerged Zhu Yuanzhang, a man whose early life seemed almost designed to embody suffering. He had been born into poverty. He lost family members to famine and disease. He spent time as a novice in a Buddhist monastery and then as a wandering beggar before joining the rebellion. He was not born to inherit a throne. He fought his way toward one. Step by step, Zhu outmaneuvered rivals, built a disciplined power base, and pushed north against the weakening Yuan. In 1368, his forces entered Dadu, the Yuan capital, known today as Beijing. The last Yuan emperor fled north to the Mongolian steppe. Zhu founded the Ming Dynasty, and Mongol rule in China came to an end. For China, this was not merely a change of regime. It was the collapse of a foreign dynasty and the rebirth of native imperial rule. The emotion of that transformation ran deep. Relief, vengeance, pride, trauma, and memory all tangled together. The Mongols were gone from the Chinese heartland, but elsewhere, their legacy lingered. To the northwest, the Golden Horde remained one of the most powerful Mongol successor states for generations. It dominated the western steppe and exerted control over the Russian principalities, which paid tribute to its khans. Russian princes learned to survive by negotiation, submission, and careful rivalry. For a long time, the Mongol presence was not a fading memory. It was a daily political reality. Yet, the Golden Horde, too, weakened over time. Succession struggles, regional fragmentation, and shifting trade patterns eroded its strength. And then another conqueror rose from Central Asia to shake the post-Mongol world. His name was Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. Timur was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, though he claimed legitimacy through association with the Chinggisid legacy and ruled in its shadow. He built his own empire in the late 14th century through ruthless campaigns across Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, and beyond. His armies did not restore Mongol unity. They brought another wave of devastation. In the 1390s, Timur struck the Golden Horde and defeated its powerful ruler Toktamish. These campaigns dealt severe blows to the Horde's authority and to major centers such as Sarai. Though the Golden Horde did not vanish immediately, its decline accelerated. It would eventually fragment into smaller khanates, including Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, and others. And in that fragmentation, something new began to rise. For centuries, the princes of Moscow had lived under Mongol suzerainty, maneuvering carefully among stronger forces. But as the Golden Horde splintered, Muscovy gained space to grow. Moscow collected tribute, expanded its influence, and slowly positioned itself as the center of a unifying Russian state. Then came the symbolic break. In 1480, during the Great Stand on the Ugra River, Ivan III of Moscow faced the forces of the Great Horde. There was no grand apocalyptic clash, but the confrontation marked the end of regular Mongol domination over Moscow. Historians often treat this moment as a key milestone in the collapse of what is sometimes called the Mongol or Tatar yoke over the Russian lands. It is hard to overstate the emotional force of that change. A people who had paid tribute now imagined Sovereignty. A principality that had bowed now stood upright. A frontier state began to dream in imperial dimensions. Russia would carry the memory of Mongol domination for centuries, even as it adopted and adapted political practices shaped in part by that same experience. Out of subordination came a harder state, one that would itself expand across the Eurasian steppe. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, the age of a single Mongol empire was over. But history is never kind enough to leave empty ground. What replaced the Mongol Empire was not one successor, but many. In China, the Ming Dynasty rose on the ruins of Yuan rule. The Ming emperors worked to restore Han Chinese political authority, rebuild administration, and reinforce the legitimacy of native rule. They repaired infrastructure, revived classical traditions of governance, and sought to secure the northern frontier against steppe threats. The memory of Mongol conquest haunted the dynasty. It shaped military policy, border defenses, and the political imagination of the empire. Even when the Ming projected enormous power, the fear of the north never fully disappeared. In the former Il-Khanate lands, no single Mongol successor reassembled the region. Instead, a shifting landscape of dynasties and confederations emerged. Timur's empire briefly dominated much of Iran and Central Asia, but after his death, it too fragmented. In the centuries that followed, new powers rose, especially the Safavid Empire in Iran, which established a durable Persianate state with Shia Islam at its core. To the west, the Ottoman Empire expanded across Anatolia, the Balkans, and eventually the Arab lands. The Ottomans were not a Mongol successor state, but they rose in a world transformed by the collapse of Mongol power and by the political openings left behind in Western Eurasia. They built something different. A gunpowder empire, centralized, bureaucratic, and enduring. In South Asia, the Mughal Empire would emerge in the 16th century under Babur, a ruler descended from both Timur and, through his mother's line, Genghis Khan. Even the name Mughal is derived from Mongol. By then, the legacy of the steppe had fused with Persianate court culture and Islamic imperial tradition to create something new. This is the strange truth about the fall of the Mongol Empire. It was an ending, but it was also a beginning. The Mongols did not simply vanish into history. They changed the shape of trade, war, diplomacy, and political imagination across Eurasia. They destroyed ancient powers, uprooted populations, and redrew connections between distant worlds. Even in collapse, they left behind the conditions for new empires to rise. The Ming inherited a China determined never again to be ruled from the steppe. Muscovy inherited the space to become Russia. The fractured Islamic world gave way, over time, to new imperial formations. Across Central Asia, the memory of Chinggisid legitimacy remained powerful long after real unity was gone. So how did the Mongol Empire fall? It fell because no empire that vast could remain untouched by succession struggles, regional ambition, cultural change, environmental disaster, economic strain, and disease. It fell because conquest is not the same thing as governance, and terror is not the same thing as permanence. It fell because the descendants of Genghis Khan inherited not only glory, but impossible expectations. And yet there is tragedy in that fall. This is because the Mongol Empire was more than destruction. It had for a time made the world wider and smaller at once. Safer roads allowed ideas to travel. Technologies, goods, and people crossed distances that once felt unimaginable. Diplomats could move between courts. Merchants could dream in continental terms. The Mongols bound together worlds that had long stood apart. But they also taught an older lesson, one written again and again across history. The greater the empire, the louder its collapse echoes. When the Mongol Empire broke, China returned to native rule under the Ming. The Russian lands began the long rise of Moscow. The Middle East and Central Asia entered new eras of fragmentation and reconsolidation. And from those fractures came the early modern empires that would dominate the centuries ahead. In the end, the fall of the Mongol Empire was not the disappearance of a people. Mongol states survived in different forms. Mongol lineages endured. The northern Yuan continued in Mongolia after the fall of the Yuan in China. Steppe politics remained powerful. The descendants of the conquerors were still there, still fighting, still ruling, still remembered. But the dream of one Mongol world united under the house of Genghis Khan was gone. And maybe that is what makes the story so human. An empire born in wind and horseback thunder, built by men who seemed sent to punish the earth, was undone by the same forces that undo all human creations: ambition, grief, division, time. For one blazing moment, the Mongols made the world tremble. Then the world they had conquered learned to live after them.